Imagine being handed a blank check, not a small one, not a modest one, a blank check worth billions of dollars, signed by some of the most powerful investors on the planet. Now imagine spending every single dollar of it, and then asking for more. This is the story of WeWork, a company that didn't just want to rent office space. It wanted to redefine the very meaning of work, community, and human connection. A company that convinced the world it was worth $47 billion. And a company that, in the span of just a few weeks, watched that dream turn to dust. Part 1, The Spark. The year is 2010. The world is still crawling out of the wreckage of the global financial crisis. Millions of people have lost their jobs. Banks are cautious, companies are cutting back. But two men in New York City see something different in the rubble. They see an opportunity. Adam Neumann was born in Israel, raised partly on a kibbutz, a collective community built on shared resources, shared meals, shared purpose. That idea of communal living never left him. Miguel McKelvey grew up in a commune in Oregon, raised by a group of mothers in an unconventional arrangement that prized togetherness over individualism. These two men, shaped by communities built on sharing, looked at the cold, corporate landscape of American office life and asked a deceptively simple question. What if work felt more like a community? Their first project wasn't even called WeWork. It was called Green Desk, a co-working space inside a Brooklyn building that Neumann was already leasing. The concept was straightforward. Instead of one company locking down an entire floor for years, multiple small businesses, freelancers, and startups could share the same space, split the costs, and benefit from the energy of being around other ambitious people. It worked. Green Desk filled up quickly. Tenants loved it. The vibe was electric. Neumann and McKelvey sold their stake in Green Desk and used the money to go bigger. In 2010, WeWork was born. Part 2, The Rise. The timing was almost perfect. A new generation of workers was entering the economy, the millennials. They didn't just want a paycheck, they wanted meaning, flexibility, and a sense of belonging at work. Freelancing was exploding. The gig economy was just beginning to take shape. Startups were multiplying, and all of these people needed somewhere to work that wasn't a coffee shop, a spare bedroom, or a stuffy corporate cubicle. WeWork offered something different. Walk into a WeWork location and you weren't greeted with gray carpets and fluorescent lights. You were met with exposed brick walls, craft beer on tap, plants hanging from the ceiling, fast Wi-Fi, and the hum of people building things that mattered to them. There were private offices for small teams, open desks for solo workers, glass-walled conference rooms available by the hour, a front desk that made you feel like you were checking into a boutique hotel rather than going to work. WeWork didn't just sell office space, it sold an identity. Members weren't called tenants or customers, they were called members. The company's motto wasn't about square footage or amenities, it was do what you love. That message resonated with a generation that had watched their parents give decades to companies that laid them off anyway. Investors noticed. In 2012, WeWork raised $17 million in its first major funding round. By 2014, it had raised $150 million. By 2015, another $434 million poured in, bringing the company's valuation to over $10 billion. WeWork had become a so-called unicorn, a private startup worth more than $1 billion, and it was galloping. New locations opened in cities across the United States, then London, then Tel Aviv, then Shanghai, then Tokyo. By 2017, WeWork was present in dozens of cities across 4 continents. The company was growing so fast that it became one of the largest tenants of commercial real estate in New York City, and later in London, seemingly overnight. At the center of all of it stood Adam Neumann. Part 3, The Prophet. To understand WeWork, you have to understand Adam Neumann. He was not a typical tech CEO. He wasn't quiet, analytical, or methodical. He was a force of nature. Tall, charismatic, with long dark hair and an almost messianic energy, Neumann could walk into a room full of skeptical investors and walk out with a check. He had a gift for making people believe, not just in WeWork, but in a vision of the future where work, community, and consciousness were intertwined. He spoke about WeWork not as a real estate company, but as a movement. He claimed WeWork would solve the problem of loneliness in modern cities. He said it would give meaning to billions of workers around the world. He mused publicly about WeWork becoming the first company worth $1 trillion. He spoke about elevating the world's consciousness. And remarkably, people believed him. The most extraordinary believer was Masayoshi Son, known simply as SoftBank's founder and one of the most aggressive technology investors in history. Son had famously invested $20 million in Alibaba in 2000 and watched it turn into tens of billions of dollars. He was always looking for the next transformative company, the next bet that would define an era. In 2017, he met with Neumann for 12 minutes. 12 minutes. After that meeting, Son committed $4.4 billion to WeWork. According to people familiar with the conversation, Sun told Neumann, "In a fight, it's always better to be crazy than smart." Sun believed Neumann was crazy enough, visionary enough, to pull it off. A few years later, SoftBank would pour more than $10 billion into WeWork in total. That money accelerated everything. Part 4. The cracks. But even as WeWork's lobby music played and its beer taps flowed, something wasn't adding up. The business model at its core had a fundamental problem. WeWork signed long-term leases on buildings, sometimes 10, 15, or 20 years long. It then renovated those spaces at enormous expense, fitting them out with the distinctive WeWork aesthetic that members loved. Then it rented those spaces to members on short-term agreements, monthly, sometimes weekly. This created what financial analysts call a maturity mismatch. WeWork owed landlords money for decades, but members could walk away in 30 days. If the economy slowed, if a competitor emerged, if members simply decided they wanted to work from home, WeWork would still owe billions in rent with nothing coming in. The company was essentially making a long-term bet using short-term money, and it was losing vast amounts of that money. In 2018, WeWork lost $1.9 billion on revenues of $1.8 billion. In other words, for every dollar it made, it spent $2. Meanwhile, the culture inside WeWork was becoming a story of its own. Adam Neumann's management style was unpredictable and, according to former employees, sometimes erratic. Tequila shots at company meetings, marijuana smoked on a private jet, decisions made and reversed and made again based on mood rather than data. Neumann had also structured the company in ways that gave him extraordinary personal control. He held shares with voting rights far exceeding those of ordinary shareholders, meaning that even as outside investors poured in billions, Neumann could not effectively be overruled. He also entered into transactions that drew raised eyebrows. He personally owned several buildings that he then leased back to WeWork, meaning the company he ran was paying rent to himself. He trademarked the word "we" and sold that trademark to WeWork for $5.9 million, only returning the money after backlash. These weren't illegal moves necessarily, but they signaled something important. Neumann appeared to view WeWork as an extension of himself, its resources and his personal finances blurring in ways that made governance experts deeply uncomfortable. The board, flooded with SoftBank's enthusiasm, largely looked the other way. The media continued to publish glowing profiles, and the valuation kept climbing. Part 5. The Reckoning. In late 2018 and into 2019, WeWork began preparing for the move that would change everything. An IPO, an initial public offering. The moment when a private company sells shares to the public on a stock exchange. An IPO is not just a fundraising exercise, it is an X-ray. To go public, a company must file documents, called an S-1, with regulators. These documents disclose everything: revenues, losses, debts, business risks, related party transactions, and the details of how the company is governed. For companies with great fundamentals, an IPO is a celebration. For WeWork, it became an autopsy. When WeWork filed its S-1 in August 2019, the financial community read it with a mixture of shock and fascination. The losses were staggering. Billions of dollars with no clear path to profitability. The governance structures were alarming. Neumann's supervoting shares meant he retained virtually unchecked power over the company. The risk factors filled pages. The related party transactions, Neumann's building leases, the trademark sale, raised immediate red flags. Perhaps most striking of all was the language used throughout the document. The filing was saturated with spiritual and philosophical buzzwords, talk about energy, consciousness, and community, language almost never seen in a serious financial prospectus. The financial press tore it apart. Analysts who had previously been supportive began asking hard questions out loud. How could a company that lost nearly $2 billion in a year be worth $47 billion? How could a real estate company, because despite Neumann's insistence, WeWork was fundamentally a real estate company, trade at a multiple normally reserved for the fastest growing technology companies? Institutional investors, whose money WeWork desperately needed for the IPO to succeed, began signaling they would not participate at anything close to the hoped-for price. The target valuation was slashed, first to $20 billion, then to $15 billion, then lower still. In September 2019, WeWork postponed the IPO entirely. Within days, the board, under intense pressure from investors and advisors, began pushing for Neumann's removal. On September 24, 2019, Adam Neumann stepped down as CEO. He left with a package reportedly worth nearly $1.7 billion, a figure that itself became a symbol of the dysfunction. The man who had guided the company to the edge of collapse was being paid an extraordinary sum to leave. Part 6. The Collapse. What followed was swift crash at a rate that threatened to push it into bankruptcy within weeks. SoftBank, having already invested billions and facing the prospect of a total wipeout, stepped in with a rescue package, taking effective control of the company. Layoffs began almost immediately. Over the following months, WeWork cut thousands of jobs, roughly a third of its global workforce. Cleaning staff, community managers, engineers, executives, all gone. Locations were shuttered. International expansion was reversed. The side projects, a school called WeGrow, a surfing venture called Wave Garden co-living apartments, were abandoned. The private jet was sold. The free beer, a beloved symbol of the WeWork atmosphere, disappeared from many locations. Adam Neumann, once the face of a generation of entrepreneurship, retreated from public life amid a cascade of critical reporting, lawsuits, and disbelief. The company that had been valued at $47 billion in January 2019 was worth, by some estimates, less than $10 billion by the end of that year. By 2023, WeWork had filed for bankruptcy. Part 7. The Lessons. The story of WeWork is not simply the story of a bad business. It is the story of an era. The 2010s were a decade defined by a particular kind of ambition. The belief that if a startup could grow fast enough, boldly enough, the profits would eventually follow. Investors, intoxicated by the returns they had seen from Amazon, Google, and Facebook, all of which had lost money before becoming world-defining companies, began applying that same logic to businesses with fundamentally different economics. WeWork was not building software that could be copied infinitely at zero cost. It was signing leases. It was pouring concrete and installing beer taps and hiring community managers. Every new location cost millions to build and millions per year to operate. The idea that WeWork could achieve the kind of exponential growth associated with a technology company was, in hindsight, a category error, a fundamental confusion about what kind of business WeWork actually was. But the warning signs were visible. Some investors and analysts saw them early. They warned that the losses were unsustainable, that the governance was broken, that the valuation made no sense. They were largely ignored, drowned out by the enthusiasm surrounding Neumann's personality and the momentum of SoftBank's billions. This is perhaps the deepest lesson of WeWork. Money, when it arrives in large enough quantities, can silence doubt. It can make a money-losing business appear healthy. It can make erratic leadership appear visionary. It can turn a fundamentally flawed model into something that looks, from the outside, like the future, until the money stops. Epilogue. Today, WeWork's locations still exist. You can walk into one in dozens of cities around the world. People sit at those beautiful desks, drink the, now less free, coffee, and build their companies. The concept itself, flexible, community-oriented shared workspace, was not wrong. It survived WeWork's collapse. Competitors who had built more conservative businesses endured. What did not survive was the mythology. The idea that WeWork was more than an office company. The idea that it was a consciousness, a movement, a spiritual enterprise. Adam Neumann, in a twist worthy of a Hollywood film, went on to found another real estate company called Flow, which raised $350 million from the venture firm Andreessen Horowitz in 2022, before WeWork had even filed for bankruptcy. The debate about whether Neumann is a visionary who was undone by excess or a charismatic figure whose vision was always more performance than substance continues in business schools and boardrooms to this day. But the numbers are what they are. $47 billion, then nothing. And somewhere in that distance, between the peak and the void, is everything you need to know about the danger of mistaking a story for a strategy. Because in business, as in life, the story will always end. What matters is what you've built when it does. If you found this story compelling, subscribe for more deep dives into the companies, decisions, and personalities that shaped the modern business world every week.